the reason to tune into the show is to actually realize that we can control those intrusive thoughts and those ruminations and that anxiety and that depression. We can actually learn to manage that. It's inside of us. So we can't control events and circumstances, but we can edit the code.
This is the Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro Podcast, the neurohacking show where we teach you how to optimize your cognition. Keep up to date at roscoeswetsuitneuro.com. Now here's your host, Toby Passman.
All right, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit Neuro Podcast. I am your host, Toby Passman. On the show with us today, we have a very special neuroscientist guest, Dr. Caroline Leaf, who is a communication pathologist and cognitive neuroscientist with a master's and Ph.D. in communication pathology and a BSc in Logopedics, specializing in cognitive and metacognitive neuropsychology. Since the early 1980s, she has researched the mind-brain connection, the nature of mental health, and the formation of memory. And she was one of the first in her field to study how the brain can change neuroplasticity with directed mind input. So Dr. Leaf, super happy to have you on the show with us today.
Thanks, Toby. It's great to be with you. And I'm intrigued by the name wetsuit. I know you live in Florida, but is there a bit of a relationship going on there?
Maybe subconsciously. It's an inside reference to a Childish Gambino screenplay. It was
okay.
Yeah, so not really, but I had to throw the neuro on the end of the podcast, so it was distinguished that there actually was a neuroscience podcast, and it wasn't. We weren't going to be talking about surfing. I had to make that clear. So
yes, well, you're surfing the brainwaves, so there you go.
Surfing the brainwaves. There you
go.
Yes, that'd be a cool logo to have, like a little surfing icon, like over some
exactly
brainwaves.
Yeah. I've actually done that quite a bit with my teaching. I've got this whole really cool slide with surfers and brains and brainwaves and everything. So yeah, it's a very nice way of explaining the brain. So we can play around that analogy, and it fits in with your podcast perfectly.
You're not kidding. Yeah. So tell me a little about just, you've gotten really deep into a super interesting niche of neuroscience, but tell me kind of what originally got you intrigued about kind of this thinking about thinking or metacognition and just how the mind, how we're able to kind of affect how our mind processes all these different things.
Well, it began years ago. I've been in the field 38 years now, so it's long. And it began when I was always interested in the brain, wanted to become a neurosurgeon as a child, and wanted to also be able to teach people. So then I thought of psychiatry, and I got into medicine. And I was fortunate to be able at the university where I had applied, that they had was starting an experimental degree, which was a combination of part medicine, part communication pathology, psychology, a bit of neuroscience, neurology, fascinating. So I actually went into that, and that really got me going. It was a nightmare to do because they squashed 7 years into 4 years. So we literally worked 7 days a week. And I remember in the midst of doing it, thinking, why on earth am I doing this to myself? But once I finished that, I went on to my master's and PhD in more neuroscience direction and cognitive neuroscience, and kind of taking that thread through. And I'm very glad I started there, because I would never, ever have got into this track otherwise if I'd gone straight into pure medicine. Because what I was exposed to from very early on was this understanding that the brain can change. And even though one of my neurology / neuroscience lecturers said to us in one of our lectures, one of the days, that, oh, hey, listen, the brain can't change, because it was what they believed in the 80s, and that therefore you need to teach your patients to compensate. And there was a whole lecture on that. And I remember challenging this professor, not in a negative way, but just saying, how is that possible? Because I'm different now at the end of this lecture than I was when I walked into this lecture. So I've changed, my knowledge has increased, my experience has changed, and my brain therefore has changed, because my brain's the organ that my mind is using. And the answer was, it's a ridiculous question. That was what the statement back to me was. So I've actually done a TED talk, The Ridiculous Question of Neuroplasticity. And basically that launched me. That was the question. And this professor wasn't being aggressive, but just said, look, that's ridiculous. The brain can't change. And I said, really? He said, okay, well, go research it. And I did. And I said, well, where should I start? And he said, well, traumatic brain injury, there's hardly any research on it because, like, if your brain's traumatized and damaged, well, just teach your patients to compensate. So start there. I don't think he thought I would take it seriously, but I did. And this is 38 years later. I'm still doing research. I had spent 25 years practicing clinically, but from day one, I saw that when we understand mind, and I know that's a massive statement because it's considered the hard question of science, but as we start to understand mind is separate and distinct from brain and body, but that the brain and body embody the mind, and that they have this unique relationship, and that you and me communicating are the result of that relationship. It's fascinating. And if you then track that back and think, okay, well, if you look at how someone who's had a traumatic brain injury, how they're communicating, how can we track back from how they're presenting in the world and track back to what's actually happened in the mind, brain, body connection, and can you fix that? And so that's where my research went. And yes, the answer to that is yes. I showed that when you direct the mind and you can change the structuring of the brain can change. We didn't have MRIs then, we had CT scans, but we saw changes in the brain. By the mid-90s, with fMRI technology, we could see the changes happening in the brain. Neuroplasticity is now on everyone knows about neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain to be changed by the mind. And I stress that because the brain can't change itself. The brain is not what we call self-emergent. Like genes are also not self-emergent. When you're dead, you're dead. When your brain's not working with the mind, it doesn't do anything. So that was fascinating, and that just spurred all this research that I continued to do. When I practiced, as well as practicing, I was doing research, and I went underground. And I say underground because for almost 20 years, I didn't actually publish. I was doing hardcore in the field research. My objective was to go and put a whole lot of publications under my belt. My objective was to actually find out what's going on and work with humans in the most distressing conditions and the most wonderful conditions, and find out, what is the core similarity between everyone and what's going on with mind, brain, thoughts, emotions, things, and communication, behavior, brain damage, dementia. I just wanted to see it in the real world. And so I had a unique opportunity to do that while I was practicing. This was back in South Africa. I also worked in places like Rwanda and so on, and done a lot of work in this country. We've been here for quite a few years in education, corporate, wherever, across different socioeconomic divides, etc. And what I have seen is that us as humans, we have this unique, incredible brain and body run by the mind, and this combination is in life. So we are in the environment from the moment we conceived. We are in an environment. As our brain develops, we start responding, and that response to the environment is encoded. And much like we have a computer, and a computer is the hardware. We often see that being the analogy for understanding the brain. The brain is the hardware, and the mind is the software. This is maybe a new part for a lot of people. The mind is actually the software that drives the brain. So the software that drives the computer. But then there's someone who's actually got to create the software, and there's someone who's got to actually code the software in, and then there's someone who's got to edit any changes, and there's also, you've got to charge the computer. So there's an energy source required. So mind fulfills all those categories. Brain and body fulfill the category of being the unique, incredibly complex hardware through which that we can put the code in, we can put the software in, we can code it in, we can fix the errors, we can charge the computer. Mind is doing all of that work. So all that is the experiences of life, and they code it in. And I wanted to understand that process, because if I have a conversation with you, I'm experiencing it. This is being encoded into my brain, and then I will have an experience from this. This is an experience, but it's going to impact how I function, and it's going to be different to how you are responding to this conversation, and different to every viewer and every listener. So our unique response to this encoded information is unique for each of us. So it's a unique filtering system, the mind, a unique response system, the brain and body, unique to each of us. So our responses to this information and everything in life is going to be unique. So if that's the case, what happens if we have a toxic experience like the isolation in COVID, or the grief of COVID, or the uncertainty of COVID, or the isolation that has impacted kids not going to school, and all these things that have had a tremendous impact on our levels of anxiety and depression and mental health. So anxiety, depression, mental health, etc. Those are the outpourings, the result of the expression of what we've encoded. So we've encoded this whole experience just by the nature of the mind-brain-body connection. You can't not have encoded. We encode everything that we're exposed to. So what can we do if it's COVID? It's happened, it's in our brain. What can we do? It's happened. What can we do about it? So it's so what we as humans can do is we can edit the code. We can actually go in and edit that traumatic brain injury. We can go in and edit the potential signs of dementia, the learning disabilities, the extreme anxiety, the panic attacks. All of those are telling us that this is the communication, this is what's happening, this is how we're presenting. And we can go in and look at that, and we can go back and edit that. Much like if you, okay, so let me say this, that if you are like in extreme anxiety and it's tripled over at the pandemic, and it's like blocking your creativity and your ability, and it's like stopping you sleeping, and which is very common now at the moment, and it's really got bad. That doesn't mean you have a brain illness. It means that the whole situation has encoded, and you couldn't get away from that, and you've responded, and it's been a toxic experience or a negative experience, and that's impacted how you function. So that code is now showing up as a signal telling you that, hey, listen, what's in you is disturbing your creativity, your functionality. It's creating a vulnerability in your brain and your body structurally, because that toxic, your brain is not wired for that toxic code, and you've got to fix it. So anxiety is actually, the increase in anxiety is actually like a call to action. It's a signal calling us to action, to dig deep and find out why. So it's kind of like I open my computer and I'm working very nicely and everything just freezes. So something is going on with my computer. Is it the software? Is it the hardware? Is it both? So I try and fix it, and maybe I edit and I get it going. Or it just gets worse and just shuts down completely. Now I can't do anything. So I have to go to Apple or wherever, and I have to get someone to help me edit the code and work out where's the software problem, where's the hardware, is it a combination, what do I do, how do I go from here, etc. And that's what I've studied all these years, is how do we do that? What's the process? How do we do that? How can we improve on that skill? And how can we apply that to the day-to-day struggles and the mental health issues that every human has, the day-to-day stuff? And how do we apply to the big problems, the mental health problems, which are like a massive traumatic event, combat, abuse, rape, the massive things that happen to us that completely wreck our lives, the early childhood experiences, the different types of trauma, etc., to the day-to-day struggles, not enough likes on Instagram or whatever, the fight and an argument in a relationship, all important, all different levels of things happening to us that are wiring in. How do we deal with those? Because those are disturbing how we function, and because the code goes against the natural wiring of the brain and the body, it's messing up how the computer works. So we've got all these signals. The computer doesn't work, the anxiety. So we've got to go and look at those to come back to find the source. So that's a big answer to, and you can unpack it in any way. Thank you for giving me such a lot of time to answer it.
Of course. Yeah, definitely a lot of
complex process.
Yes, for a complex organ. So I'm curious in terms of, this is the ability to actually alter and edit the code of our mind. I mean, this is something that probably wasn't even talked about too much before we started actually accepting that neuroplasticity was a real thing, that we could actually be able to physically change the brain and rewire the brain in new ways. So I'm curious now, with all of your decades of research, what have you found to be some of the best tools to actually go about editing the code of the way our mind works?
Excellent question. So there's a lot, but there's a lot of techniques, and there's a lot of amazing techniques out there that people can use. What I've tried to do is to understand the system of how this whole thing works, and then once you understand the system, then you can use the system to your advantage. So the system that I've developed is called the NeuroCycle, and it's based on a theory. It's based on the theoretical research, clinical application in all different fields, as I've already mentioned: dementias, Alzheimer's, learning disabilities, extreme trauma, etc., all that kind of, all those areas, as well as the day-to-day struggles, etc. And so it's a system that is where we're using our mind to manage our mind, to manage the brain and the body. So that's it. So the using your mind to manage the mind is the whole editing of the code. So it's, first of all, am I getting enough energy? Am I plugging the computer in? Is there even energy going? And that would be your most basic stuff. Like, obviously you've got to look at things like diet and exercise and whatever. But, and in addition to that, that's sort of the nutritional side of things, and making sure that the hardware is functioning properly. But the energy part is more one of getting myself into a neurophysiological state where I can actually do something. Because if my computer's doing this on the screen, I mean, you can't, if it's shut down and blacked out, you're stuck. So we have to just get a little bit, let's charge it again, let's restart the computer. And that's where things like decompression comes in. So one of the first elements is, let's just calm down the neurophysiology, and that's decompression, or brain and decompression exercises to prepare the brain and the body. And that's things like, the traditional things, breathing, all the different types of breathing, the different ways of meditating. And there's a million different ways you can do that. You can do it super quick in 10 seconds. You can do it in longer, visualization, exercise, movement, laughing. So there's a lot of those very well documented scientific elements that help to get the computer charged again, to get you to that neurophysiological state where you can get a little bit deeper, get further with now that I'm switched back on. Okay, now let me now start gathering awareness. And what do I gather awareness of? How am I showing up? What am I saying? What am I doing? What am I feeling? What am I feeling in my body? And what is my perspective? So those are 4 categories. I call those signals, warning signals. And those are collectively being produced by the mind-brain-body connection to help you. Everything about your mind, brain, and body is on your side. It's all for helping you. So when we feel like our brain and body are failing us, it's more that they're telling us something, that there's something going on. So our natural instinct is, I'm in pain, suppress the pain, move from the pain because it's scary. But actually, when we embrace the pain and face the pain, we can actually then find out the source. Much like an example used by a colleague of mine is that if you stand on a nail and it goes really deeply into your foot and it really hurts, and you go to the doctor and you say, I've got this terrible pain in my foot, and the doctor says, okay, here's some ibuprofen that'll help with the pain, and sends you away. You're still in pain. The pain goes for a bit because the ibuprofen temporarily reduced the inflammation and help with a bit of the pain, but you didn't remove the source. You haven't identified the source. So, I mean, that sounds like such an obvious example, but it's very, very easy to, if you're using that analogy, it's really kind of easy to apply this to our life. So the gathering, so we've done the decompression. Now to get to this whole analogy of the nail in the foot thing, what do I do next? Is I've now got to not just look at the symptom, I've got to look at what the source of the symptom is. So I've got to gather, in order to even start, I have to gather awareness of my pain. And that pain will come up in those 4 categories. So gathering awareness is describing the pain that I'm in. And when I say pain, it's a kind of an umbrella word for a little bit of anxiety to a lot that's crippling. So it goes along the whole range of 1 to 10, a little bit of depression, a ton of depression, a little bit of irritation, and then think of a scale of 1 to 10. So, it's wherever you are on that scale in that moment. So obviously it's a major thing, it's a 10, 9, 10. If it's a more minor thing, it's a 1, 2. We don't ignore even the minor things either, because those can accumulate. So if you have lots of little minor stuff, those, and you don't deal with them, they basically accumulate like dirt in your house, and eventually it's going to be a mess. So we want to pay attention to everything. And the way that we gather awareness is by looking at those 4 signals. So once I've gathered awareness, amazing neurophysiologies happen, incredible stuff. I will start connecting with my non-conscious mind. Now, my non-conscious mind is operating 24/7, and it is the fastest and most phenomenal part of us, where our wisdom is, our driving force is, our aliveness. It is basically helps us to stand back and observe ourselves and give ourselves wisdom, give others wisdom, have deep discussions like we're having now. This is all this incredible wisdom that's in us, and it operates 24/7. The conscious mind, it's only awake when we're awake, and it's working now with the unconscious mind for us to have this deep discussion. But when you go to sleep, your conscious mind switches off and your brain and body regenerate. Between the conscious and the non-conscious is the subconscious, which is a bridge. So when I look at these 4 signals, I'm actually going to start pulling up thoughts from the non-conscious through the subconscious bridge into the conscious mind, not unconscious. Non-conscious. Unconscious is when we sleep or when you get knocked out or you have an anesthetic or something else. So it's a state that the brain and body go into. It's like it's suppressing neural firing and things so that you go to sleep, versus the states of mind that we're in. So while you're awake now, non-conscious, subconscious, and conscious are all working very hard to process what I'm saying. And they're working when you're sleeping tonight, just your unconscious is going to be working to do all the work of regeneration and sorting, etc., etc. Okay, so coming back to, we've done decompression, we're gathering awareness of the 4 signals. As I gather awareness of the 4 signals, I'm going to start bringing something up, and I'm going to bring up, and I'm holding a tree here. This is like a little toxic looking wiry tree. And the reason I have this is because in our brain, our experiences are coded into these tree-like structures, and then neurons, and these parts are dendrites, and the axons. And so this structure is really good and as an analogy because it looks like this in the brain. And so every experience we have from in the womb at a certain point, obviously, to where we're at now is being coded in. So coded into the brain and the body, it's coded into these wiry looking things. Good ones, there's a nice healthy looking one. Okay, so for the good ones, and those are the bad ones, and then you have some really good ones and you have some really bad ones. So it's all those scales that I was speaking about. So when I talk about coding, I'm talking about wiring. Now, not only is it in the brain in the structure, but it's also in every cell of the body, and every cell of the body has a structural change as well. So the cytoskeleton, which holds the cell in place, has got very complex structures in that also hold the memory, which is fascinating. So we have 37 to 100 trillion cells, which means this conversation is going into a tree that looks like this. It's not a wiry tree, it's a good tree. And also a change in our cytoskeleton and right down to the level of our DNA in every cell. So that's why we have body memory. You hear about somatic memory and body memory and yoga and movement therapy and all these, and laughing, and all these things are fantastic because they help to release because if you have a lot of toxicity that in your brain, you've got toxicity blocks in your body, and those things can help release that. Different for every person, different amounts, different ways. And that's where the decompression activities also will facilitate that kind of process. So decompression is done at the beginning, but it can be done at any stage during the process of deconstructing and finding these things. Okay, so gather awareness brings them up. As soon as I'm aware of these, you may not see everything in the first moment. You won't see everything. It's going to take you at least 63 days to really see what's on here. And so there's a time frame involved. So it's around about 9 weeks that you're going to take to really get a handle on what the anxiety was. And someone may be thinking, oh my gosh, I can't wait 9 weeks to manage the anxiety. Every day you do this, you'll feel more in control. But to get the full control and the full understanding, it takes that long to rewire. And this is why people tend to get stuck, is because they want a quick fix. We live in quick fix world at the moment. Give me the tablet, give me the 5 steps, I want 5 steps that work now and fix me instantly. Give me the quick tip. Those are just temporary band-aids that until you've done the work and you can use them. I have nothing against the hacks and the tips and things. They're great. I even give those to people, but I always point them towards you have to do the work of finding the source so that I can help you in the moment of your panic attack and your anxiety or your learning difficulty or whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to get a good brain building, learning, detoxing process in place. So that's another huge thing that's part of this. So as soon as I'm now gathered awareness of this, I have now weakened it. So I'm going to shake this thing. And the shakiness is meant to kind of give it an analogy of, as I'm aware, then the thought, which is the neuron with the dendrites, and in the dendrites, there's information. And that information are all the memories that are clustered into this thought complex. And this thought complex represents concepts. So it could be your experience in COVID. It could be that childhood abuse. It could be that experience in a toxic relationship. It could be that bullying you had in the workplace, whatever. It's all in there, in these different. So each experience doesn't just have one memory. It has a bunch of stuff that's happening all in one go. And all those memories cluster and they group, they categorize inside the brain into these clusters. But if they're in the non-conscious, they're driving me. And whatever I think about the most grows. So if I'm paying a lot of attention to this, if I'm going to work every day anticipating another day of hell, I am growing this. Now, I'm not saying that it isn't hell at work. I'm just saying that an awareness, and that will produce this tremendous anxiety. If we want to get out of that work environment or that home environment if possible, but while you in there and transitioning, you need to know how to manage. So I'm not decrying the extreme situations, but in the general, as soon as you focus on something, gather awareness, which takes your attention and focus to this point. You destabilize this thing. This thing is a bunch of chemicals, vibrations, energy flow, proteins folded incorrectly, abnormal energy flow, a lot of inflammation. Your immune system hates these for good reason. These disturb your health and increase your vulnerability to disease, and your immune system is all about protecting you. So it will send out immune factors, so there's inflammation and all kinds of stuff. And so this is not a good state. You can live with this for years, but the more you live with this, the worse you become physically, the more your mental health is impacted, the more your anxiety increases, etc., etc. So once we've gone to awareness state, we've now pulled these up and we've weakened them. Something that's weakened means I can change it. Non-conscious, it's strong. Conscious, it's weakened. But in weakening it, it's very overwhelming. So especially if it's a huge thing, so we just have to do it in very small bursts of time. So when we work and do the NeuroCycle, of which decompression is the preparation, gather awareness is the first step, you want to limit the time you spend. So I always say to people, 15 minutes minimum. And well, you can go less, but 45 max. And then you don't do any more work on that big thing in the day. You just end the day with the fifth step. And I'm going to tell you what that is now. Okay, so then you gather awareness. The next thing is you need to reflect on what you've gathered. So I've pulled this thing up. I'm aware of these, let's say, anxiety, stomach ache, getting irritated often, and perspective, life sucks. Okay, so there's like the 4 basic things I identify the first time I do it. So those are all pointing towards a thought. It's pulling up a thought. And in the top part, the dendrites over here, I'm going to have the detail of how I'm seeing myself. What's my interpretation? What am I saying about myself that's in the situation or related to the situation? So in here are the details of the words that I'm saying, the emotions that I'm feeling, the choices that I've made, etc., etc. inside here. So the signals take me to this. And so that now I'm editing at the moment. This is a whole editing. I'm looking for the problem. I'm looking at the software that's inside the hardware. This is the software. This is the program. And now I'm going to say, okay, well, where does that come from? It's attached to this tree. So I'm going to have to deconstruct and go right down to here to get there. So how do I do that? So I now need to go to step 2, which is this reflect step, where I ask why. Why do that's what I'm seeing. Why? Why am I having this emotion? And it's the asking, answering, and discussing. You immediately want to then capture on paper what you have gathered and reflected on. The writing process, we all know, everyone talks about journaling. There's 2 stages of writing we need to go through. So step 3 and step 4 are both writing processes. The first one is a deep, insightful gathering of data, writing down what you've gathered and reflected on, which then pulls up other related thoughts and digs up and kind of like digs the soil away from the root if this is a tree. It starts showing and revealing the errors in the code. And day 1, you might only see a glimpse of one, and day 2, a little part, and in day 3, and so on and so on and so on. So it takes around about 3 weeks to really start seeing what's down there, which is the root of the experience. It's what you went through. It's the origin story, which has produced the whole story. And then after that, once you've seen that, then you can actually change that into something, reconceptualize. You can't change what's happened to you. It's always there, but you can take the sting and the week out, because in the 3 weeks, as I'm doing this, this gathering awareness, this reflect, this writing, and I will explain step 4 and 5 now. As I'm doing these 5 steps, I am weakening this more and more, and I'm transferring the energy. What to? I'm transferring it over to building a new thought. So first of all, that thought looks like this. Got all these props here. Small. So it takes me about 21 days to get this reconceptualized into this. Now this gets smaller and smaller. I just don't have a small one of these on my table at the moment, but it's small and it's lost its sting, it's weak, and this is the new way that I'm going to see myself. So okay, there was maybe an abusive relationship that you're in, and you keep getting into these abusive relationships, so that's all this, and it's making you so anxious and like whatever. And so you do this work, and by 21 days you realize, okay, it's because I was abused as a child maybe, and you didn't even know about that, or you'd suppressed it or whatever. So that's your story. It never goes away, but it controlled you and it controlled your relationships. Now you realize, okay, that's a reason, but that's not the truth. The truth is that I'm totally lovable, totally capable of moving forward. And that anxiety is just because I hadn't quite processed this, and I don't have confidence, and I have whatever, shame, etc., etc. And those aren't the truth. So this is how I'd like to be, but it's tiny. this has still got the potential to come back. It's not strong enough yet to override this growing back. So we need another at least 42 days. So 2 more cycles of 21 to grow this and to stabilize it. So we see that, and I'm giving you very visual analogies. By day 42, it's grown. I'm doing 5 steps daily, but now only for 3 to 5 minutes, super quick. But those do the world of wonder. They help you get more insight, more ways of strengthening this, more ways of seeing yourself more. So you're adding more, you're growing more and more onto how you want to be. And that's overriding that other thing. By day 63, we're looking at a really nice, and I've got more plants, but don't have enough hands to pick them up. But you get the gist of it. I've gone from this tiny one, and I've now got this very strong, stabilized, automatized habit. And what we want is that 95% of our day is run by what's automatized. In other words, an automatization doesn't mean robotic or unintelligent. It means extremely intelligent, and so intelligent because we're phenomenally intelligent. It's a driving force, and it can be a toxic intelligence, or it can be a healthy intelligence, but it's a super, super intelligent. But you don't want this intelligence driving you. You want this kind of intelligence driving you. This is too strong to drive you. This will override. So we have to get this strong enough, big enough to get through the subconscious into the conscious mind when you're triggered in an equivalent situation. So you're starting a new relationship, and as you sit down for the first date, this starts trying to rear its head. But because this is strong, it's going to have a hard time getting through. And this is going to come up. So you're going to be able to go into that date with a different view of yourself and your ability to form a relationship, etc., and all the elements and all the details that are involved in that process. So that's the big picture. So we got to the first step of writing, which helps the 2 sides of the brain to really work together. It is a pouring of your thoughts on the paper with absolutely no particular order. It very often doesn't make any sense, and that's great. The more you get out, because what you're doing is you're bringing up all kinds of things from the unconscious, all kinds of thoughts with memories that you hadn't even thought of before. Plus, you are revealing more of that root of the toxic thought. So the writing process does a million different things, but that's one of them. And it activates the basal ganglia in the brain, which is deep inside the brain, that helps with cognitive fluency. And those get stuck when we're very anxious and when we are being triggered by something toxic and it's dominating our thought pattern. So when we do this work, we activate our basal ganglia and we start freeing them up, and they become looser again. And writing really facilitates this process a lot. So the first stage of writing, I've developed a system called the metacog, which I did with my patients for years, and it's phenomenal. You can write, you don't have to use it, but it is very efficient and very quick at getting to the core of an issue more insight, deeper and quicker. So I teach that in my books. This book, Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess, my NeuroCycle app, I have a video. We're putting more and more content out on how to do the metacog and how to do this. And I've got TikTok, I've got Instagram, to be able to help people, to podcasts, etc., to learn this in different ways. But it's all there. So essentially, step 4 is also a writing step where you look at what you've written, but now you're organizing it. So it's very much this has happened. What am I going to do about it? I call it the recheck, and it's where you reconceptualize and you are reconstructing what you've deconstructed in the first few steps. Because that third step is a real deconstructed mess. It's like bashing down that house. If you're renovating a house, so it's chopping down that ugly weeds out of the garden, or it's like the mess of the computer, everything's going crazy, but I'm starting to see what's going on now. So it's looking, this is the problem. And then you reconceptualize to work out ways that are going to help you see this thing differently. And so an example would be something like, okay, I understand now that this constant relational issue where I just don't ever allow a relation to go beyond a certain point because of a trust issue. This trust issues definitely come from me seeing parents having terrible issues in their marriage, and I just didn't trust that marriage could work for. And you didn't realize that was an issue, and so whatever. And so you say, okay, but that was their marriage. This is not me. It was coded in. I'm editing the code. I want this relationship. I'm totally capable of forming. I don't know if this is the one, but I'm open to now the possibility. And that would be a reconceptualization. To get to that level will not happen in one day. It will take at least a cycle of 21 days to get to a level of that. Sometimes you're going to get real good clarity in 21 days. Other times you are going to get to a point you say, okay, this is as far as I'm going to get now. I'll stabilize this and then I'll go to another cycle. I mean, I've had some patients with such severe trauma that it's taken them up to 12 cycles, which is 2 years of work to get to the point where they actually can finally say, all right, I'm ready for a relationship. Others that it's the first, it's so different. Every struggle is different. Every person's unique. You hear this all the time. It's really real. And there's no recipe. There's no formula. The time that I give is the pure hardcore mind-brain science, neuroscience of how we can rewire the brain. So that's what that whole element and concept is. But how many cycles you need, exactly what you'll see at each point. I mean, very often what happens is as you're processing through at day 21, around the day 18, 19, 21, you can actually feel worse. And it's called the treatment effect. And it's so often the case. And I mean, I'm sure you can relate, and everyone listening can relate that you start, okay, I'm going to deal with this issue. This is a pattern in my life. I've got to deal with this issue. I'm going to start doing all this stuff. This anxiety, this pattern, this whatever. Because when you identify those 4 signals, you're basically identifying a pattern that's consistent, that's disruptive to you. And you start seeing the reasons why. It can be soul destroying. It can be like, oh my gosh, this should never have happened. I had stolen childhood, I've had stolen time, and we've got to grieve. So there's a grieving that happens, and that comes along with feelings of depression and anxiety. But it's different to where you started, where the anxiety cripples you because you just can't put a label to it. You just don't know what it is. It's just like there. Versus, okay, I'm more anxious, but it's different. I'm anxious because of what happened. And then you've got to keep moving forward, which is what the system of the NeuroCycle helps with. So this can be used, a lot of therapists, there's thousands of therapists around the world that do their own therapy and have their own thought, but they're putting it into this cycle. You don't have to go to, I'm all for therapy. We need help and support, but you've got to live with yourself 24/7. So between therapy sessions or coaching or counseling, or if you're not having, you can still do this because we can learn to edit the code. This is it's a very human thing to do. You've even done it without even knowing about doing it. We're doing it when we learn to cope with something, we've edited our code. I'm just formalizing it scientifically and helping people to get into an organized system so that we can be very proactive in managing mental health.
I'm really glad that you just brought up therapy, because that's actually what I was thinking is sort of like, as you're explaining the NeuroCycle, it sort of seems to me, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it, but it's sort of teaching people to be performing psychotherapy upon themselves, on their own mind in a way. Whereas like a lot of psychotherapy is, the therapists are challenging certain thoughts, certain beliefs that you may be holding onto deeply and are creating certain issues in whatever aspect of your life, whether that's your relationships, your social life, your whatever it is, your health, and kind of going to the roots of that and working on changing that and shifting some of those core belief patterns. So do you see any, I guess, I wanted to ask, when you look at what psychotherapists do, and now I think also we have to include in that realm, I think coaching is becoming such a large field, health coaching, performance coaching. And I want to kind of hear your perspective on coaching and therapy, and maybe how that fits in with what you're talking about with the NeuroCycle, and whether you think, kind of traditional psychotherapists or coaches are digging deep enough or digging in the correct places in order to, as your book is titled, clearing up your mental mess. Are they able to do that, or do you feel like there's anything missing?
I think, yes and no to that question. I think therapy is essential, coaching, counseling is essential, but it's got to be done properly. And, that's, you're going to have, when I say done properly, that's a big word, because who defines what properly is? So I think that the issue here is that I'm totally in favor of people going for therapy, because we can get to the point where the mental health issue, which is manageable, has become a problem, and then support is needed. Also, we are social creatures. We are really good at helping each other. So I think that there's 2 levels here. We need to help each other more. We need to not be scared to help each other. If you're not a therapist, it doesn't mean you can't help yourself and you can't help someone else. There is a lot of wisdom inside of each of us, and I think that needs to be pulled on more. Our individualistic society has almost discouraged that, where there's a huge amount we can do for each other as a community. So I'm very hot on helping people understand this process, as you can see, so that you can feel more empowered to be able to manage anxiety and depression and see them not as illnesses and that you're crazy or something, but that they're very, very real. They have a biological impact. They code in, but they can be edited, and you are very capable of doing a lot of that yourself. And that therapy is a fantastic support, especially when you feel that the need. So it's very much up to the individual. There are some phenomenal therapists out there, and there's some really bad therapists out there. Like there are great doctors and bad doctors, and that's great scientists and bad scientists. So that's inevitable. And that's where each person needs to make sure that they find the therapist that works for them. Because what may be a really bad therapist to one is a fantastic therapist to someone else. And as long as you are having your need met, and that you're progressing forward. I have one concern about overarching concern about therapy, and I've had this discussion with many therapists because I train physicians and therapists. I have a certified facilitator coaching program myself, and a therapeutic program and everything where I train people. And the concern is that a lot of therapists will say that their patients just don't seem to be moving forward. So when we become aware of our stuff, if we just meditate and breathe and decompress and do techniques and just take a thought and try and replace it with a series of techniques, that's good, great for an interim. But in the long run, we are going to have to go and take the nail out. So take the ibuprofen, because at least you can get through that throbbing pain in the moment. But we are going to have to get below, and we're going to have to get that nail out and learn to live with the scar. And that takes time. So the time factor isn't always considered in therapy because it's not trained. It's not part of most therapeutic training. It's fairly new. We all know things take time. We know these that habits. Most people think habits take 21 days, which is not actually scientific at all, but it's become part of, just put into, in the 60s, a book was written based on a surgeon's experience, and it became this huge popular thing, and now it's taken over everything, 21 days for everything. And there is also, we do see in the body that there are cycles of 21 days that the body goes through, like to heal blisters and whatever, and there's multiple cycles. So there's definitely something in that 3-week thing for sure that's absolutely accurate. But when it comes to the mind, it takes more than just one cycle. And this is what I wanted to test with my research, and there's some other, not enough researchers that have done this. I have to tell you, we need more research in this field, which is why I'm doing more. But at day 21, you're not there yet. As I said with that little plant, we have to go further. And I think where a lot of therapists maybe get stuck, and I can't find my little one, but a little tree, it's got stuck inside one of these trees. What happens, I think, a lot in therapy is people get stuck at the they don't go long enough, and too much is done, and a lot of things are given to a person to do that may be overwhelming to them. But if you take less and do it over longer periods, it's very successful. And so a lot of good therapists are instinctively doing this. They may not do exactly 63 days, but they work in cycles. So every school system that I've worked in, I've set up the cycles. When I worked in therapy, I worked in these cycles. And there's no limit to how many cycles. So that's, if I had to have a criticism, that is definitely one that I would have. If you get to a point of only, let's say, going 14 days and there's major change in the client, I wouldn't move on to another aspect unless it's totally in some way related. I would make sure that that's stabilized before dealing with another issue, because otherwise that person's going to come back, and that person's going to feel frustration because, hey, we dealt with this, now it's back again. What's wrong with me? And you don't want people to go into a shame spiral, because that thing is very, it can take you backwards. And that's another whole thing you have to work on. So I think it's really just a matter of us getting the science out there and therapists applying it. The other thing about therapy is the biggest impact of therapy is the patient therapy, a therapist alliance, and it's the relationship. So no matter, at the end of the day, the instinct of a therapist who's been trained and counselor, coach, and humans, our nature is to help someone. And our nature instinctively is, there's a cause. Let's try and get to the root, and let's try and find a way of solving this. This is not new, what I'm saying. This is human nature. It's our instinct. So what the therapy is doing is really, and psychotherapy and these things is really putting that into the realm of let me help you. Let's do this as a collaborative effort. When you're in that place where you can't think and make decisions, let me give you some alternative perspectives. Let me help you see this in another way, because on our own, we can get so stuck. So the NeuroCycle is amazing to help you find your areas to do all these things I'm saying. And you can get to the point where you can get, it shows you where you're getting stuck. And so you can go to therapy and saying, hey, this is what I've seen. Now, how do I look at this? what could be another way? And that's the first step, is the active reach, is, okay, what am I going to do? I've learned this. Now, the fourth step helps you to reconceptualize and say, okay, this is happening, what do I do? The active reach is now applying that, practicing that new way of thinking, but in an anchoring way that keeps you not going back to the toxic. But this is what I can handle today. I recognize this has happened. This is why I'm doing this. I'll be okay. It's a statement. It's a way of anchoring us back. And the active reach expanded into therapy is a way of helping the person find those, helping the person. Therapy I see coming in a lot in step 4 and step 5, where there's a lot of, okay, this has happened, how can we look at this differently? And now what can you do between therapy sessions to help practice that? So it's not taking away at all from therapy. It's working hand in hand. It's creating tremendous enhancement. So I've had like neurologists using it who are doing a lot of biofeedback sessions. They found that was fantastic to show the patient, but then the carryover didn't happen. So they added the NeuroCycle to the program, and that's made a tremendous difference. And we've done research. I've done research with neurologists in exactly doing this combination and that kind of thing. So looking at the QEEG and so on. So, I mean, that's a big question and a big answer. I'm very pro therapy though, and I'm very pro people. If the therapist doesn't work for you, you're not under any obligation. It doesn't mean they're bad. It means that it didn't work for you, and don't be scared to go and find someone else.
Right. I love the just taking way more accountability though, for each of us in terms of managing our own mental health and something, you mentioned, I know in the book, is just, so if you're experiencing depression, you're not depressed, you're experiencing depression. I love that terminology of how you separate that and make it clear that it's like something that you have to, or that you're able to actually manage and deal with. That's not who you are as a person.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a lot of research that's been done on resilience, and I've done indirect research on resilience, and we are a lot more resilient than we think. Now, that doesn't mean that we mustn't deal with trauma. That are the ways we show up. We have to deal with trauma, as I've been describing. But when you help someone to be empowered, resilience is activated. So you get tremendously empowered to actually ask for help, because we have this thing over, ask for help, I'm not resilient. No, asking for help is resilience. It is a recognition that I need another little bump along the road. I need a little bit more of a catalyst. I need something to help me here. So I showed with my research that when you empower people to look at things in this way, you can get an 81% improvement in things like anxiety and depression, which, as you also mentioned from my book, I said, you can't have depression. You can have cancer, you can have diabetes, because there's an actual biological underlying cause. But depression, it doesn't have a biological underlying cause. It has a biological effect, because the depression is what you experience. It's what you have. It's a warning, not what you have. It's a warning signal. So you feel depression.